1964 and the assassination of African-American leaders during the decade. And Dr. Baldwin, I think you've already given us some excellent information in reference to the assassination of the various African-American leaders associated with civil rights and et cetera. But let's look at what is going on now in American society. And while there might not be that much controversy over the Civil Rights Act, especially public accommodations, we do find that we do have some real issues in terms of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. That is the Voting Rights Act, not the 15th Amendment, but as it was passed, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Yeah, let's talk about it from that perspective.
Yes, I think also with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there's still discrimination in employment. There's still discrimination in educational opportunities. Having taught at a university for 30 years, I can attest to that. There's still discrimination on many levels in our society. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 really hasn't been followed or embraced to the letter. That's the first point I would want to make, and because it's one way of saying that we need to continue to push for the full realization of the provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Also, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we know that there are many states now led by Republican governors that require voter IDs. There are restrictions on voting practices, etc. And so we need to realize that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we are still trying to make sure that we as Americans live out the fullness of what these pieces of legislation are about. We still have not fulfilled the promises embodied in these pieces of legislation. So that's my concern, is how we view the legacy of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It is a legacy of promise, a legacy of hope, that we should be about inclusion, not exclusion. And of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1965, we should be about complete political enfranchisement, not excluding people from the voting processes, not excluding people from the right to hold public office, etc.
And so that's a curious kind of thing to talk about limiting the participation. It appears to me that up until quite recently, we were thinking about how do we expand the franchise so that more people can participate in it. And now I think the president made some statements in reference to that about it really does not seem to be a good policy to think in terms of eliminating your vote. People that might vote for you, even people who might vote against you, that's still not a way to really be successful in terms of the electoral process and convince everybody that this is a real democracy.
Exactly, and we often forget that not only the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but also the Civil Rights Act of 1964 dealt with voting, because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited the use of literacy tests, poll taxes, and other vehicles that had been used to prevent people from voting. So both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were really about increasing the capacity of people to participate in the political processes of this country. Not simply to have access to jobs, employment, health care, education, voting, but to participate in what was going on in terms of the political processes.
And so now we're moving, what, are we going backward in reference to this?
I think in a sense we are. We still have, as I said earlier, have not lived out the provisions of both the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. We're still in a process of becoming, so to speak, of really living out the provisions of these pieces of legislation in the interest of the common good. And I think we're still about that. We have not fulfilled that.
Well, now, what would your message be to young people, Dr. Baldwin, who might not be concerned or might not participate in what we're doing here? But how does the Civil Rights Act impact upon them?
I think young people, their first step involves learning about history. So many of our young people are unfamiliar with what went on in the 1950s and 1960s. They have to have a sense of history. It's about consciousness raising. If they don't know what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was about, if they don't know what the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was about, then they have no sense of history, and they cannot build on what people in that day provided.
And they don't understand what we're saying now about how important the suffrage is, and you really don't know how important it is until it has been denied you.
Exactly. Dr. King and others laid the foundation, and now we have to find a way to build on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, creative ways of building on these pieces of legislation, and also advancing the cause for civil rights and voting rights and political power. And if we don't find ways of doing that, then we're not true to the legacy of the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act.
You know, Dr. Baldwin, a very disturbing statistic that I saw in this morning's newspaper talking about suffrage in the state of Tennessee and the metropolitan area. They said that only 6% of the population, 6.5% of the population actually participated in the suffrage. Now, we're not talking about just black folks or white folks, but only, this is front page news, that only 6.5% of the individuals that are registered to vote actually get out and participate in the suffrage. Now,
that's tragic. And it means that we have not learned the lessons of the Civil Rights
That's right.
movement.
And not only does it mean that black folks have not learned the lessons,
it means that white folks have not. And the Civil Rights movement was about not only black folk, but it was about white folk.
About voting and about public accommodations and et cetera. And so,
yeah, it was about making us true to our democratic creed. And if we have those kinds of statistics, it means that both white folk and black folk have not understood what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was about, what the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was about, what the Civil Rights Movement as a whole was about. We have failed to understand
what democracy is all about, which is to say that you cannot have a democracy unless you've got people participating in it, and we can complain all we wish about the amount of money that is involved in it, but now the money really does not matter if you can bring the statistics up from 6% to 25 or 30%. Then you don't have to worry about the money in politics. A vote is more important than dollars.
Exactly.
Certainly it is.
Democracy exists when people make democracy, when they participate in democracy, and we're not seeing that today.
And so the point we're trying to make here is that not only is it a black thing to participate in the suffrage and to enjoy civil rights, but it's an American thing. That is, it's something that's open to all of us. And when we get to a situation that only 6% of the population, the metropolitan population, vote, then we have to understand that there's a real problem in terms of what this democracy really means.
And we have to ask ourselves, are we really participating in a democracy? Or are we talking about an oligarchy? Because when few participate, then you don't have a democracy.
And you've got all the money that is involved in here, and you can either literally almost buy an election, et cetera. No, there's a real problem, and I think that not only should we sound an alarm, but the alarm ought to be sounded nationally to let everybody know that people ought to get out and vote.
Irrespective of race, irrespective of color and creed and religion and political orientation.
That whatever, get out and vote, register and vote and whatever. And I think that's the point we're trying to make in terms of dealing with this. And let me thank you, Dr. Baldwin, for bringing by that excellent information in reference to this. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.